Leonardo Leo Martin was a patrol captain in a small town in the southeastern United States, where everyone knew everyone else and took pride in helping their community. His career began, as most police officers do, on patrol. He was not a man who sought attention, but he always maintained order and expected the same from his colleagues. His path to becoming a police officer was long and difficult, and by the time he was promoted to captain, he had already proven his dedication to the job and his resilience in the face of adversity. But behind the facade of the perfect servant of the law, there was a secret that he was willing to hide at any cost. Martin was a quiet, calculating man. He did not allow his feelings to rule him, preferring to always remain reserved and keep his emotions under control. Many of his colleagues admired his ability to remain calm in the most tense situations. However, this calmness hid something more than just the ability to control his reactions. Leo was a man with a rigid moral position, which for many years allowed him to avoid compromises large and small. But this principle was not as flawless as it seemed at first glance. In this small town, corruption was hidden beneath layers of local obscurantism, and Leo, without realizing it, was caught in a game he couldn't escape. He started out as an honest cop, but gradually his attention shifted to lucrative but dubious offers. It all started with small things, simply turning a blind eye to illegal trade, winking at violators. But with each passing year, the stakes grew. He knew it was wrong, but he also knew it was too late to back out. All this time, Leo was a skilled manipulator, arranging his life to never push the envelope. He was a captain, and his colleagues, like Carson Riley, respected him. But Carson had a different perspective than everyone else. He was the one who always wanted to get to the bottom of things. He was smart and observant, and at some point he began to notice oddities in Leo's behavior. Carson and Leo had worked together for years. Their relationship was strong and they both trusted each other, but Carson began to suspect that Leo might be involved in something more serious than just minor infractions. It all started with unexplained calls and meetings that Leo held in private. Carson watched his colleague become increasingly tense, as if he was hiding something. And then he noticed something even more disturbing: small changes in Leo's behavior, his disappearance for a few hours and then unexpectedly returning, as if nothing had happened. Carson decided to be cautious, but something inside him told him that his colleague might be involved in something more serious than just harmless legal shenanigans. He began conducting his own investigation, noticing details that others might miss. He even began checking Leo's financial records and personal connections, hoping to find at least one confirmation of his suspicions. Then one day, while scrolling through old records, he came across something that left no doubt. There were too many connections between Leo and the local criminal element, and not all of them were legitimate. Carson was shocked. He knew something had to be done about this, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Leo was a captain, which meant he was surrounded by power and protection. Carson also knew that if he decided to expose Leo, it would not only end his own career, but also jeopardize the safety of his family. At some point, Carson realized that he could no longer remain silent. He had to investigate further, no matter the risks. A single question began to form in his mind: how far is Leo willing to go to keep his secrets? Carson knew that the situation could escalate into something much more dangerous, and the more he learned, the more he felt trapped. A trap that was not of his own making, but one in which he found himself caught up. After Carson uncovered evidence that Leo might be involved in criminal activity, it became clear to him that he was on a dangerous path. He couldn't simply pass this information on to his colleagues. The cases weren't that transparent, and any attempt to expose the captain could lead to a scandal that would engulf not only the police force, but the entire city. Carson was no naive man, and he knew that his steps had to be as careful as those of an ice dancer. He continued his covert game, pretending that everything was fine. But inside, he was growing more and more disturbed and anxious. He couldn't share these discoveries with the other police officers. No one knew what he had unearthed. Even if he managed to find allies, at least half of his colleagues were probably either in on it or under Leo's control. There were only a few left who could help him, but they were too few to openly oppose the captain. Leo noticed the changes in his colleague, but he didn't pay much attention to them. He always trusted Carson, considering him a loyal and devoted employee. Carson was an intelligent, honest man, and Leo perceived him as infallible. But with each passing day, it became more and more difficult not to notice how Carson became withdrawn. His behavior became more guarded. Leo couldn't understand what was happening, and it unnerved him. He watched Carson, trying to figure out what was making him act so strangely. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but Leo knew that something was wrong. For several days, Carson avoided direct contact with Leo. He withdrew from him in private conversations, missed several joint patrols, avoided talking to him at meetings. His colleagues may not have noticed it, but Leo sensed that something had changed between them. He even tried to talk to him, offering to help, but Carson avoided the conversation, making it clear that everything was fine. This only increased the captain's suspicions. With each passing day, Leo began to realize that his own calm was an illusion. Meanwhile, Carson continued to search for answers. He began checking all the connections he had with other people in the city, and he found more and more strange facts. While in one of the local cafes, he met an old acquaintance, a nightclub owner who had previously been involved with Leo when he worked in another department. The man was nervous and clearly avoided direct questions. After a few casual questions, Carson overheard him unwittingly let slip that Leo often visited clubs, and sometimes it had nothing to do with official work. He said that he saw the captain in the company of people whose faces Carson did not recognize, but knew that these people were clearly not upstanding citizens. Carson began gathering information from these meetings, trying to figure out who exactly Leo had been in contact with. He suspected that it might all be connected to some larger criminal network, but he couldn't quite figure out how it all fit together. It didn't make sense to him that someone who seemed so upstanding at work could be involved in something so dark and dangerous. One evening, a few days later, Carson decided to take a risk and meet with a man who could tell him a lot. He contacted a former informant who had once worked with the police and later turned out to be a convicted drug offender. This man knew the city like the back of his hand, and despite his criminal past, was willing to help Carson for a small fee. The meeting took place in an empty, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. Carson didn't know what awaited him, but he couldn't refuse. He knew that this might be his only chance to learn more about what Leo was hiding. The informant revealed that the police captain had long had ties to a group involved in the supply of drugs and weapons to the city. At first, they paid him for protection for the business, and then a more serious game began. Now Leo received a percentage of each deal, participated in negotiations, and even helped cover their tracks. This was the discovery Carson had been looking for. He knew that if there really was such a network in the city, it couldn't be allowed to continue operating. But what to do with this information? Carson knew he couldn't just walk in and tell his superiors. He was risking not only his career, but his life. This realization created an internal conflict within him. He tried to weigh the pros and cons, but the more he thought about it, the clearer one thing became. If he did nothing, whatever happened next would be on his conscience. The next morning, Carson knew he had to act. He decided to gather his strength and, despite all the risks, confront Leo. He understood that this was not just an investigation, but a real war where the stakes were too high. Carson couldn't put off the decision for long, and every day he didn't act increased his anxiety. He knew that time was against him. Everything he had learned left no room for doubt. If he didn't act now, things could spiral out of control and become even more dangerous. His only chance to uncover the truth and prevent disaster was to gather enough evidence and get it into the hands of those who could investigate. But Carson knew it wouldn't be that simple. Leo was a captain, and his connections to the underworld were so deep that the entire system was built around his influence. Even if Carson found evidence, it was no guarantee of success. He could be in danger of being exposed, and what he found could cost him not only his career, but his life. Instead of acting on a whim, Carson decided to organize his information into a logical chain and proceed cautiously. He began to conduct covert surveillance on Leo, recording his movements and encounters. His plan was ambitious. He had to find the moment when the captain would be most vulnerable. This was not easy, since Leo was always cautious and kept his distance from suspicious situations. But Carson was confident that he would find a moment when Leo was not as attentive as usual. One evening, when Carson thought he had lost all hope of success, Leo made a mistake. At a meeting where he was discussing the terms of a new agreement with drug suppliers, he allowed himself to relax. Circumstances were such that they found themselves in a rather secluded place, and Leo did not notice that he was being followed. Carson managed to capture several key moments with a hidden camera, which he installed in a nearby room. The evidence Carson had collected was overwhelming. He knew this could be the tipping point. Video and audio files that captured Leo's conversation with one of the gang leaders, as well as photographs that showed the transfer of bags of cash and guns, were a solid case to convict the captain. But the picture was not as simple as it might first appear. With every hour he spent thinking, Carson began to doubt that all this would lead to success. The system was so corrupt that even with this material, he could face obstruction and intimidation. It could all go wrong, and Carson could become the next victim in a long chain of silence and fear. The next morning, he showed his evidence to several people he trusted. But everyone, from his police colleagues to his lawyers, looked worried, and some even tried to convince him to drop the case. "You don't understand, Carson, who you're dealing with. This isn't just a criminal gang, it's a system that controls the city," said one of the experienced officers he consulted. Carson listened, but his resolve did not waver. The question he faced was how exactly he could pass on the information and get the case moving in the right direction. He could pass the material on to the department, but he was absolutely certain that this would only lead to his investigation being ignored, or worse, to the complete destruction of his career. The lack of trust in the local police and corrupt officials only increased his fear. Carson was forced to make a decision that would put everything on the line. He knew that if he didn't do it now, he would never get a second chance. He began to think about how he could turn over evidence to the feds, but that would require preparation and perhaps creating an alibi that would keep him safe. At this point, Leo sensed that something was wrong. He increasingly suspected that someone was beginning to suspect him or was monitoring his actions. He sensed tension in the air and began taking precautions to cover his tracks even more carefully. He organized more complex routes for meetings, abandoned the use of regular phones, and began using people who could be framed if necessary. Leo was a master at this game of hidden intentions, and Carson knew he didn't have much time. Carson knew a showdown was inevitable. Leo knew he was under suspicion for a reason, and it would soon come to a head. He was prepared to act decisively. He knew that if he simply gave Leo up, his personal safety and reputation would be at risk, but if he didn't, all would be lost. He sensed that the moment would soon come when he would have to choose: preserve his honor and expose Leo, or remain in the shadows and continue to hide the truth. Every step he took felt like a game of life and death. Carson was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Every move he made, every calculated move, could be fatal to his career and his life. He sat in his apartment, the tapes and photographs he had collected on Leo lying in front of him. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a personal conflict with a system that was so deeply entrenched that any deviation from the course could lead to the destruction of everything Carson had ever known. His mind no longer separated the concepts of work and personal life. Everything was intertwined into one big dilemma: expose Leo and risk his life, or stay in the shadows and allow the system to continue as if nothing had happened. Carson sat for a long time, looking at the photographs of Leo in the company of shady people who passed bags of money and guns. It was clear evidence of his criminal activity, and it could be the cornerstone of an indictment. But the thought kept running through Carson's mind that even with this material, it could all fail. He knew how easily the system could destroy someone who tried to destroy it. Even if he took up the case, he would be in grave danger. With each hour that passed, Carson felt the pressure mounting. He was beginning to realize that if he didn't act now, he might lose his opportunity. Time was against him. But what could he do? He considered turning over the evidence he had gathered to federal authorities, but that would require preparation. Carson realized that he couldn't trust the local police. They were too deeply involved in this corrupt world. He decided to find a way to create an alibi that would allow him to protect himself before acting. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that every step would be dangerous. As soon as he left the apartment, his feelings immediately began to change. He felt like he was being watched. Someone was watching his every move. He quickened his pace, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. It was too late to try to hide. He couldn't believe that this was really happening. He tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being caught was becoming more and more obvious. Someone knew about his investigation. His feelings were confirmed when, as he was walking outside, he spotted a man in a dark suit who turned out to be one of Leo's associates. Carson knew intuitively that this was a signal. The man in the suit followed him, and each step he took became more confident, as if he knew Carson had no way out. This was the decisive moment. He tried to quicken his pace and break free from his control, but the man was faster. Carson knew that if he fell into the hands of this man, his fate would be in the hands of others whose goal was not just to control his life, but to destroy it. He was taken to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. The place was dark and desolate, and the feeling of being cut off from civilization only added to his anxiety. Carson knew that this move meant that he would not be able to simply walk out of here as if this were a routine detention. There was something more dangerous here, something that consumed people, and return from this place was far from guaranteed. As soon as he was brought into one of the interior rooms of the building, Carson felt a sense of dread wash over him. The place was empty, ominous, lifeless, and everything around him reminded him that this was not just a place where criminal matters were being resolved. There seemed to be an unknown system behind everything. He already understood that he was in the center of a hidden world, the existence of which he did not even suspect. Time dragged on. Carson's heart pounded, and every step he took through the dark building felt like his last. This wasn't just a takeover, it was more. He realized that he was about to face people who would act without mercy, and his fate would mean nothing to them. He was just part of a larger game, and his participation in it was forced. His life didn't matter here. He knew that if he didn't find a way out of this situation, he wouldn't live to see the next day. But he was in a dilemma. He knew that everything he tried would take him to a whole new level of risk. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. He knew that if he made one wrong move, the highest price would be paid. Carson stood, peering into the dark corners of the abandoned room, his mind filled with thoughts of what to do next. His whole life had become a matter of survival, and he realized that his past, all his achievements, no longer mattered. He was faced with a choice that would change not only his fate, but the fate of everyone who might become part of this dark history. The quiet footsteps on the polished concrete surface of the room and the sharp air only reinforced the realization that his future was no longer in his hands. Carson sat in the shadows, leaning against the cold wall in the corner of the abandoned building. Time had lost all meaning. The silence was deathly silent, broken only by the sounds of his own breathing and the footsteps that had once seemed so ordinary but now felt like a call to his final choice. He knew that nothing would be taken back, nothing would be fixed. What had been done could never be forgotten. He had paid too high a price to keep moving forward. Hours passed, but the door to this dusty void did not open. Carson no longer knew how much time had passed. He sat waiting, and every sound in the hallway was a signal. Someone was returning. Someone else wanted to talk to him, or maybe even decide his fate. He did not know that this time would be his last step. He felt his body and mind gradually succumbing to fatigue, losing the ability to respond to what was happening. All he knew was that he was in a game where the rules wouldn't let him turn back. He'd made the wrong decision. He'd made the wrong decision to think he could expose Leo and come out of this unscathed. He'd been too confident in his abilities, trusting that justice would eventually prevail. Now he knew. His fight wasn't a fight against the system or crime or the law. It was a fight against the darkest side of his own soul. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Carson looked up, but no figure entered the room that impressed him. He already knew what it would be. He knew that his freedom would depend on how much he learned to look beyond these walls, beyond this trap. The man in the doorway, his face hidden in the darkness, was in no hurry to engage in conversation. He simply stood there watching Carson intently. Soon he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The atmosphere grew tense, and Carson realized that whoever was in the room with him wasn't going to just let him go. He was part of something bigger, something that was pulling him into the abyss. As the man approached, Carson felt a strange power in his presence. He stood still, knowing that the slightest wrong look or movement could be fatal. But he could not contain his anxiety. All he knew was that his life hung in the balance, and this man was the one who could decide its outcome. But the silence that fell over the room was almost unbearable. Carson realized that he simply had to wait until his future became clear. He didn't know what awaited him in this dark room, in this atmosphere of abandonment, but he knew he was on the edge. The man in the dark suit came closer, his shadow enveloping Carson, who couldn't help but feel a cold fear. He knew that this moment, this look, was the last one that could change anything. His steps seemed heavy, but everything around him was as silent and empty as his soul. All he could do was remain silent because he already knew that no words could change what was happening. A few minutes later, the man walked up to a table in the corner of the room, sat down on it, and began taking some documents out of his pocket. Carson tried to follow his movements, but he knew that no information would help him now. All he could do was wait until his life's journey ended or took a new turn. He was like a victim who had nothing left but fear and resignation to the inevitable. As time dragged on, Carson finally realized that he had no other options. Confronting this man, this world he had been drawn into, was doomed to failure. He could not win. He could not escape. He knew that this might be the end, and his heart sank with bitterness. All his ideas, all his aspirations, everything he had ever thought important had been destroyed in an instant. He was prepared to never see the light beyond these walls. As the man stood, Carson felt his eyes drawn to what he was doing. He knew that every move he was making was calculated. He was simply part of this terrible plan, and this moment, when everything he had done would come to a single point, he could no longer avoid it. But in that moment, something changed. Carson felt his own struggle, his entire determination, take on new meaning. He didn't know how it would happen, but now his inner sense of change became more obvious. Carson was still sitting in the corner, his body stiff, but his mind focused on what had happened. There was tension in the air, every cell in his body on guard, waiting for some final blow. He knew that this was where his story began and ended. The door slammed behind him with a loud bang that echoed in the empty space of the abandoned building. It wasn't just a noise. It was the moment when everything changed. The man who entered the room stood in front of Carson, not giving him the opportunity to try to somehow get rid of this situation. Carson did not know who he was, but he felt that this man was the one who was pulling him out of his usual reality and throwing him into a new reality where there was no room for doubts and mistakes. Everything that Carson had done up to this moment did not matter. All his efforts, all his steps, all his search for the truth, they did not matter because now he could not get out. He was trapped, and someone's hands were holding her tightly. "You know, Carson," a voice finally said. Carson looked up, but he couldn't see the man's face in the total darkness. He seemed familiar, but he couldn't place the feeling. His gaze was fixed on the man's hands, which continued to move, as if each movement were part of some cold, precise game. "You thought you could figure this out?" the man continued, casually pulling his wallet out of his inside pocket. "You thought the truth was something you could just pull out into the light and then everything would change." Carson felt his chest tighten. He couldn't understand what was happening. This wasn't reality. It was a nightmare, and he was still in this nightmare. What the hell had he done? He tried to remember everything that had led him here, every moment, every step, but his thoughts were all jumbled up like clouds before a storm. He remembered the first thing that had happened to him when he first started investigating Leo's case. It had all been small steps, a few photos, a few conversations. It had started as a simple investigation, but now it had become something more. He had put too much effort into understanding who was behind the crimes in the city. But now he knew. The truth he was looking for was not the truth. It was a weapon, and its arrows could only hit him. The man in the dark suit came closer, his steps confident and sharp, and every time his feet touched the floor, Carson felt the weight of those steps, as if the man was the very shadow of the law he was trying to fight. "You've been trying to bring him to justice for too long," the man said. His voice emotionless but still heavy, as if the words weren't spoken to Carson but to someone else, invisible, hidden in the dark corners of the building. "You thought Leo was just another link in the chain, didn't you? You were wrong." Carson felt his heart begin to beat faster. He knew now that his life was on the line. Every step this man took was a step that took him further away from the world he had once lived in. His attempts to investigate were disappearing into this foggy reality, and now he was in a place where everything was under control, not his control, but the control of those behind this man, this world. He still didn't know what was coming next. He still didn't understand where this conversation was going, where this game was going. But he knew he couldn't stop. Images were playing in his head, moments from days past when he was sure he could change the world. But it was too late now. This game was bigger than him. This man was part of the same force that controlled not only Carson, but his future. "Have you realized that you were never really safe?" the man said, not waiting for an answer. Carson didn't know what to say. He tried to gather his strength, but his thoughts were shattered. He knew he was at a crossroads with no way back and no way forward. All he could do was watch the man, listen to his words, and hope that he wouldn't be the one to destroy him. "You made a mistake in trying to find the truth," the man continued when Carson didn't respond. "Truth is an illusion. It does not belong to those who seek it. It belongs to those who control it." His words echoed in Carson's mind like something alien and terrible. He realized he was a pawn in someone else's game, and now he was prepared for his steps to lead to his downfall. At that moment, everything changed. Carson realized that his actions would have consequences. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a fight for power, for survival, for remaining human in a world where every choice cost lives. Carson felt despair rising in his chest. His mind was clouded, and thoughts were leaking through him like water through a sieve. He sat frozen in the shadows in this abandoned room, and every second felt like his last. Everything he knew felt like a lie, and every word this man said only added to his inner turmoil. This moment, this collision with reality, was inevitable. Carson knew there was no going back, no choice that would make things right. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be part of something so massive that he couldn't control it. The criminal enterprise that controlled his city was deeper than he could have imagined. He had been too close to the heart of it, and now it was more than just a threat to him. It was consuming him, sucking away what was once left in his life. When the man in the suit spoke, his words were like a death sentence. Carson felt everything inside him crumble. "You thought you could control this," he repeated like a mantra, and each time Carson felt his body clench into a fist. He couldn't understand what was happening, but he felt his past crashing down on him like an avalanche, leaving him no chance. Leo, who had been a part of all this, was now an invisible threat, a shadow that could not be reached. Carson knew there was nothing left of him that could save him. He had thought the investigation, his fight for the truth, for justice, had all made sense. But now he knew. His own existence had become part of the very shadow he had once tried to fight. The man in the suit came closer, and Carson felt the space between them shrink. He was prepared for what was coming. He knew there would be no conversation, no attempt to resolve this peacefully. He had long since lost all illusions about justice and truth. All that was left was to accept that his life was not in his hands. This man standing before him was not just a figure in an investigation. He was part of a structure that had long since transcended the law. He was a representative of the force that manipulated everyone, including Carson. This moment became a black spot on the map, where his personal ideals, aspirations, and even ordinary life ended. Carson sighed, and for the first time, he seemed to feel the strain of breathing. He was burned out, empty inside. He couldn't escape, couldn't get back what he had lost. He was trapped, with no doors or windows to escape through. He wasn't just a prisoner, he was part of this system, and now his fate depended on what the next phase of this game would be. Carson tried to focus again, but every step the man took toward him pulled him away from the reality he had lived in before. He was part of a more complex machine than just an individual trying to catch a criminal. He was at the center of the scheme, at its very heart, and now he had to figure out how to survive in this world. The man in the suit finally stopped right in front of him. His dark eyes never left Carson, and there was no pity or fear in that look. Carson realized that all his attempts were futile. He felt like all his experience and knowledge of this world was losing its meaning. He couldn't cope with the fact that he was now part of this game, part of this shadow. "You thought you were special," the man finally said. His voice was cold as ice, and every word echoed in Carson's mind with startling clarity. "You're not the first to try to fight this, and you won't be the last. This isn't your world. You're just a tool. You've always been a tool." Carson felt his body react to these words. He couldn't understand what to do now. Every action seemed like a mistake, every move a step into the abyss. But this man who stood before him was the very same guide to this world in which there was no concept of honor, truth, or justice. Everything was an illusion. "You still won't understand," he continued, "but you're already part of this game. Now you have to understand what it's like to be a pawn." Carson wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was listen to his life slip away into the void. At that moment, Carson suddenly realized that he had reached the point where his choices no longer mattered. His steps were not leading to an answer, but to an inevitable fall. All he could do was wait to see what would happen next. Carson stood in the empty room, feeling every breath become heavy, his thoughts trapped in the void. No sounds except his own breathing. The void was what surrounded him, filling the space, consuming everything around him. But inside him there was another feeling, not just emptiness, but a coldness that was seeping into his very core, becoming a part of him. He was trapped, but the trap was invisible, not visible. It was squeezing him from the inside, paralyzing his mind. Everything that once made sense, justice, duty, the righteous fight, was nothing. It was gone, burned in the fire of his own decisions. With each passing day, with each step, it became clearer. He was part of this game, and maybe not even the most important part of it. He thought he could change something, that he had a chance to escape this world, but all he could do was watch his life spiral into an empty, endless spiral. He knew there was no turning back now. The shadow he was trying to push away was always there. Carson tried to break free, but the shadow was his own, and the more he tried to get away from it, the tighter it held him. This world, these people, it had all become a part of him. And now he had to decide how his story would end. As he stepped out of the shadows, he felt a chill run through his bones. He knew he was standing on the edge of an abyss. Every step could be his last, and that knowledge never left him. Carson paused, listening to himself. He felt something inside him tighten. It wasn't fear, but despair. He saw that everything he had worked for had been destroyed. There was no bright end, no victory, no redemption. He was simply part of this machine that he couldn't control. He felt the world around him shrinking ever more, like some kind of mouth from which there was no escape. He was no longer a man standing in the way of struggle. He had become part of this machine, part of a force that did not ask whether he wanted it. He felt it on his body, in his soul. He had become part of it, and he could not refuse it. With every second, with every moment, his actions became more and more conscious. He knew that he had one last chance, a chance not only for himself, but for those who could still be saved. His own life had lost its meaning, but maybe he could save others. It was the only goal that remained before him. But there was a fire burning inside him, a huge, powerful fire of rage and determination. He wasn't ready to be consumed by this world, this system. He wasn't ready to be part of something that left no room for his ideals. He couldn't allow himself to be just a pawn, part of a machine that was destroying everything that had ever meant anything to him. Carson started walking. It wasn't just a step. It was a step into nowhere. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know where he would end up in a few seconds, but he knew it was his choice. He walked despite everything, despite his helplessness and fear. He felt his body becoming lighter as he lost touch with this world, as his steps became more and more determined despite his doubts. He barely noticed how his movements were becoming faster. His consciousness was starting to fade, but inside his mind there was a light. It was the light of despair, showing him the way forward. He knew that he didn't need to look back anymore, that every step was a step into the darkness, but the darkness didn't scare him anymore. He was ready to face it. He was ready to pay for everything he had ever done. Carson moved, and the world around him became increasingly blurry. He didn't know where this path was leading, didn't know what the consequences would be, but he knew he couldn't stop. He was on the edge, between two worlds, between light and shadow. And in that moment he felt that he was no longer afraid. He had made this decision, and it was all that was left for him. No one knew what had happened to him. No one knew what had happened beyond that place. His story, his life, seemed insignificant now. But for him, everything was clear. He was ready to take the final step, a step into the darkness, into the abyss, where there were no promises and no regrets. The last step, Carson took it. The second his foot touched the ground, time seemed to stand still. The world around him vanished, dissolved into nothingness, and all that was left was his own consciousness, his own sense of what he had done. He disappeared without leaving a trace, and only the shadow that followed him continued on its way, carrying with it everything that was left behind.